Again, thank you for joining us this evening. You're now attending the webinar entitled Charting a Path Between Textbook Maps and Historical Cartography to Teach Indigenous History. Our leader for this session is Juliana Barr, NHC Fellow 2018-2019 and Professor of History at Department of History, Duke University. I also want to note that we are joined tonight by Jesse Odom, who's at C.E. Jordan High School, Durham, North Carolina. Jesse is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. And you already see that she is very active in the chat right now, and we are looking forward to interacting with you, Jessica. Let's get started. Juliana Barr is a historian specializing in the dynamics of Native European relations in North America, especially as they relate to questions of diplomacy, political economy, and Native sovereignty. She is the author of Peace Came in the Form of a Woman, Indians and Spaniards in the Texas Borderlands 2007, and co-editor of Contested Spaces of Early America 2014, and of Why You Can't Teach U.S. History Without American Indians 2015. She is now writing about the long durée of Native history and how it reframes our understanding of the era of European arrival in the Americas. Again, it is indeed a privilege and an honor to have you with us tonight, Dr. Barr. And everyone is here and we're ready to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank all the wonderful folks at NHC and NCSS. And it's very exciting to be here, and I love working with public school teachers. And so this is great fun, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I do. So today, what I wanted to do is address the question of how one can use visual sources like historical maps in the classroom, and far more specifically, how those maps are utterly essential to balancing the misdirections embedded in textbook maps when it comes to teaching Native American history. And you'll notice, of course, that as Mike was saying, I co-edited along with 4 other phenomenal scholars the book, Why You Can't Teach U.S. History Without American Indians. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart. So I want to start by looking at this map. So what you're looking at is one of the earliest maps we have. It was, in fact, half of an illuminated vellum map of the world. And actually, you may have a better sense of how huge this was. So it would cover an entire wall. But I'm zeroing in so you can see more detail in this one. We guesstimate, or scholars guesstimate, that it's from about 1545, simply because the Amazon River appears in South America, and we know that no Europeans had seen it until 1542. So we guess the date from that. And so in a sense, just from that, we might think about, right, that maps tell us or record for us the advancement of knowledge, or in this case, European knowledge. And so this is, of course, what the Spanish and Portuguese at this point have discovered, mostly from the sea and navigating the coastlines. And of course, they also are bringing together travel reports from other parts of the world as well. You might also look and note very carefully all the flags, the standards, the royal standards that are up and down all the coastlines. And if you were to count, you would find 3 Portuguese flags, 2 flags of the French fleur-de-lis, and 13 Spanish standards. So what those tell us is that, in fact, maps are not simply records of accumulating knowledge. They are also the machinations of politics and geopolitics, right? This is very much, all the parents listening can well imagine what I'm about to say, right? That these maps say, mine, mine, mine. This is the breathless progression from I see to I possess, right? So these are claims, and they represent desires. They do not, of course, represent the reality. This is 1545. And we could even see it more clearly, and I know it's very hard to read unless you can zoom in on the map, but that great blue banner across North America says Nova España across it. And so, of course, by that, in this map, we also know that Spain is claiming the entire continent as its own. So all of this should remind us of what one of the great scholars of maps, J.B. Harley, tells us, that maps were tools of imperialism as much as were guns and warships. And those flags tell us very specifically, right, that this is a paper war of different colored flags marking out the imagined borders between European arrivals. So now if we were to take this and then leap to a textbook map, we might see certain differences if we considered the lack of detail in the interior of Perea's map, right? That our textbooks, and I'm not going to say Perea, because I'll come back to that in a minute. Our textbook maps, right, imagine vast, empty, open spaces, quote unquote, wildernesses that were waiting to be tamed and settled. So Indian lands have no borders, they have no lines, they have no political markers. Indian towns have no names. And what you do see is that, of course, the only lines we have, so here, the textbook has decided to divide up the continent by economy. In this one, you might notice that it's all what they designate culture areas. I'm not sure how they're defining culture. Or in this one, they've divided it by language families. But I want to pause here and point out the other lines in this map, because these maps are not empty of political lines. If you look at this one, and you look at this one, you will see the grayscale of 48 states. Now, these are textbook maps that purport to teach students what North America looked like before European arrival and centuries before the existence of the United States. And yet, they have put the grayscale of 48 states in there. And this is, of course, this is writing manifest destiny into the map. And I have talked to different geographers who said, you know, this is a complete political decision by textbook makers, right? Because what I often get, many teachers will say, oh, but, you know, my students would never be able to figure out where anything is if they didn't have the state lines. But what geographers say is, oh, no, you know, look, if you put the mountains in, if you had the Rockies, if you had the Appalachians, if you had rivers, there are other ways to signal space in these maps that do not completely and utterly distort a student's understanding of what this map is purporting to teach them about. And so it's utterly critical then to notice that grayscale. But so then the next step in our textbooks is they wipe the slate clean. Okay, now we've got to show you the route of all those daring or devious explorers and conquistadores as they charted their way, cutting and hacking through the Everglades and through rainforests and through swamps and through forests and through the deserts, desperately seeking a path forward in this new unexplored land, right? So now, oh, there are no native people at all. Then in the next stage in our textbook, all of a sudden now we do have political lines. They are now huge colored spaces or regions that have sort of taken those colored flags from that Perea map and they've writ large across the continent, right? All these rival claims by European empires. So this is supposedly showing you what, quote unquote, colonial North America looks like. But of course, these zones are as much imaginary as those flags. And of course, no empire controlled anything approaching the spaces within which these lines have been drawn. But also, look what's happened to Native people, right? They're still there, but they're sort of floating free, not really connected to any one area. And they have no borders in juxtaposition to these borders of supposed imperial control. So now what the textbooks are trying to tell us, of course, or convey to us is, well, of course, if Indians don't have borders, Indian nations don't exist, they have no claims to the land, and thus, of course, everything is up for grabs, and the Europeans have grabbed it. And the real contest here now doesn't even involve Native people. It's about these rival European claims. So consider yet another textbook grab. Consider what it means to actually rename all the Americas with news. New France, New Spain, New England, New Netherlands, New Granada, right? All of this rewrites all these areas of the Americas as new European creations. Simultaneously, of course, denying and erasing any native past, but also, far more importantly, a native present, much less a native future. So again, we've got this sense, oh yes, it's all there for the taking. But the reality was far, far different. And in fact, when Europeans charted out across this landscape that I'm showing you in this map, they didn't hack their way through wildernesses. They didn't wander aimlessly through deserts. They traveled native highways and they traveled native thoroughfares that had been there for centuries. One Frenchman, for example, in 1685 compared an Indian highway in Texas to the highway that ran between between Orleans and Paris in France. And he said that, in fact, the native highway was wider, was more level, and very well beaten. So, in fact, he found the infrastructures in the Americas better than those in Europe. When Europeans moved along these highways, they also didn't move freely. They were subject to laws of native jurisdiction. They were subject to Indian border controls and even passport systems. And in fact, if they tarried where they should not, they could be arrested for trespassing. And there's a great legal account in 1675 of a Spanish Franciscan who was hauled up on charges of trespass because he had traveled into Apapiame lands without permission. So notably, what we find when we go into European records and when we go into European maps, in fact, is that Europeans were not drawing maps that looked anything like what we would find in our textbooks, because they were all very, very carefully mapping native nations and native borders. Why, might you ask, were they doing this? Well, one, we could consider the Spanish and French first and foremost, right? That we have colonial ventures, right? They've come to the Americas for profit, for other intent, right? And any colonial venture by the Spanish or by the French is absolutely dependent on the involvement of Native people. They have inclusive forms of colonialism, which I'm constantly reminding my students, oh, inclusive sounds nice. It's not nice if you're being made part of an encomienda system by the Spanish. But these visions then compel them to find and seek out Native allies or Native converts. So if we were to consider, for example, this map by Samuel Champlain of New France, and I'll zero in now here, you can see the absolute and utter density of all these native towns and villages and cities all throughout the Great Lakes region, right? And, you know, and it's always humorous, right, that we say, oh, yes, you know, the French established a fur trade. I'm like, the French did no such thing. The native people, nations across all of this region had insanely profitable fur trade networks. And the French just came to beg and plead and said, please let us be trading partners within your networks. Please allow us access to these networks. So what Champlain is doing in this is mapping out all the towns and cities that he and his men and the coureur de bois will need to seek out in order to build alliances and build ties so that they might be allowed entry into those fur trading networks. And he will, of course, also bring along Jesuits, because he will believe that, oh, well, if I promise you everlasting life, maybe you would be my trading partner. He has secular intent there. The Jesuits, of course, have other intents. But the Jesuits too, right? They need to know where to find these converts. If we leap to the other side of the continent, we could look at these phenomenal maps made by one of the greatest colonial cartographers of this era, Eusebio Kino, who was a Jesuit operating in Sonora. And what we discovered there is, of course, how is he going to find converts? How is he going to find the best place to build these missions that he so envisions changing the landscape of this native world? And again, when we zero in on his maps, we find stunningly dense native towns and settlements throughout this landscape. And so in fact, right, the Europeans on the ground, living, active, seeking to fulfill their goals in North America are mapping all of this with great, great care. And in so doing, what we find is that, of course, every time they map and recognize native borders, they are recognizing native sovereignty in its essence, which is, I would define, the power a nation exerts within unambiguous borders. And we can see this again in these maps. So, and I should pause for a second to say, many of these maps I'm using, I've taken from digital websites like that at the John Carter Brown Library, the Newberry Library. And they've really, this digitalizing project of all these different archives have so opened up opportunities, I think, for educators, because, you know, if we were to look at this map, and right, this is what you would normally see in a book. And it's like, oh, who can tell anything from this? But these digitalization projects allow you on their websites to zoom in to the tiniest detail. And all of a sudden, not only does the map come alive, history comes alive, and our ability to use these maps in these insanely creative ways in the classroom. But for my intents and purposes here, let's zoom in, because when you do, what you find is this. All over that map, which looked like it had great open spaces, what you see is again and again, this is the land of the Sioux, this is the land of the Paducas, this is the land of the Illinois, this is the land of the Missouris. They are recognizing first and foremost in their maps, this is somebody else's land. If we switch to an equally massive Spanish map of the Spanish provinces, again, what you see when you zoom in, the Spanish version, Tierra da, this is the land of the Carrizos, this is the land of the Pampoas. They are writing this at each and every turn. Now, partly, again, as I was saying, right, they have colonial goals that need to be met, so they need to find native people. But also, we really need to remember an insanely basic thing, is that their lives depend on knowing whose land they're in. When I cross this river, am I leaving the land of the Carrizos and entering the land of the Pampoas? And perhaps I've established good relations with the Carrizos, but the Pampoas don't know me, and so they might kill me. Or perhaps I've established good relations with the Carrizos, but they are enemies of the Pampoas. And so now I am known in the landscape as allies of the Carrizos. So when I cross that river, the Pampoas are going to come for me. So we've got to actually remember really practical things as well. Forget colonial goals, because many of them are not going to be met. We've got the reality on the ground that European lives depend on knowing exactly where they are. And so they are mapping this exactly. There's another really, really important point at this point, a good lesson for students. And this is too, that these are mapping native nations. These are not mapping individuals. I think all too often in our textbooks, right, that we take modern day notions of quote unquote minorities within the United States. And we see them, whether we see them in racial terms or ethnic terms, right, we see them as individuals because, and we can argue very clearly in terms of, right, this is US policy. US policy has spent hundreds of years trying to break down and destroy native nations and reduce native people to individuals. But what European maps are reminding us is that we cannot understand American history if we don't recognize native nations and forget the whole notion of Native individuals. Because when we think only in terms of individuals when it comes to Native history, then we reduce everything to a quote unquote cultural encounter. And these are not cultural encounters. These are political and international relations that are ongoing. And I will talk more about why this is so critical. Because when we think about, and this is a slightly different version of the other map I was showing you a second ago, made by this phenomenal social demographer at Stanford, right? The issue here is sovereignty and nationhood. And the reason it is so important is that if we do not recognize it from the beginning, then we absolutely cannot understand what the United States denied over the 19th and 20th centuries through its policies. And we cannot understand the here and now and the present day reality that there are 574 Native nations with formal political relations with the United States. And so we have to understand the nationhood and the sovereignty of Native nations. And we might think too, just as a sidebar here, right, that the British and then the United States loved to make treaties with Native nations. And one of the easiest things I always ask my students is, okay, so think about it. Who does the United States make treaties with? And they will get it. Of course, no one makes treaties except with other foreign nations. So every single time the United States negotiated a treaty with a Native nation, even if they were using that treaty for great ill intent, and they absolutely did, they will negotiate 1,642 treaties over the 19th century that slowly dispossesses Native nations of their lands, right? So I'm not saying these are good things, but every single time they negotiate that treaty, they are recognizing Native sovereignty, and they are recognizing that the people they're making that treaty with are a sovereign nation, which is why we come full circle to the here and now, and we also must understand the importance of those treaties, because those are the greatest tools that Native nations have in the here and now when they negotiate with the United States. And I should point out, too, you're probably wondering, okay, hey, but you haven't mentioned the United States yet. You haven't mentioned the British. And that's because we come to the here and now and the answer to, okay, so why doesn't any of this appear in our textbook maps already? Why don't we have any of this story in the here and now? And that's, of course, because Anglo-American maps, followed by U.S. textbook maps, are really adept at erasing Native presence and claiming all of North America again as there for the taking. Because, of course, now we've got to think of the concept of exclusive colonialism. But, of course, the British, and then afterwards the United States, saw no role for Native people within their colonial schemes and colonial endeavors. And so, of course, their policies were first and foremost expulsion and extermination. So their maps are not going to carry the same import and goals within them. So we can consider this one. This is this phenomenal map by John Mitchell, which shows the states going all the way to the Pacific, which I just love. Can you imagine? Virginia all the way to California. Or you might pause to consider Thomas Jefferson's vision of the Northwest Territory here. Clearly, right, he has no recognition there that there are all Native nations within the lands that he is already having dreams about taking up. But we might consider, I think, the best example of all for students, I think, again, thinking about those most powerful things we can do in the classroom, is to consider the Louisiana Purchase. We tend to think, right, that Jefferson bought it, but of course, and we also tend to think, oh, and it was, or at least textbook maps, though, and it was a huge bargain because he paid only $3 million for it. But the thing is, he didn't buy any land at all. What he really bought was the right to negotiate 222 times between 1804 and 1970 with all the Native nations that fell within the purported borders of this purported purchase. So again, we might think, right, about this complete misdirection in our maps and the ways we understand what's going on. And here's another really important map too to think about, because of course, all those negotiations that I just mentioned, the 222 times, which actually, in fact, as estimated in 2016, in fact, cost the United States over $11 billion. Many of them were fraudulent, and the United States itself recognizes this. So this is a map that was drawn by the Indian Claims Commission as they were seeking to negotiate and sort of finalize see-out treaty negotiation promises. And what it's showing you is that basically everything in white on that map, the United States itself recognizes they have no legal claim to by their own treaties, that all of those areas in white, their treaties recognize as still being those of those Native nations. And we can, if people want to talk about McGirt later, we can talk about that, because obviously McGirt, the area recognized in McGirt, is in this area supposedly ceded. So that becomes an interesting question in and of itself. Okay, so how then can we use historical maps to help our students reimagine the reality that I've been trying to describe here? And we can do this in a number of different ways. And of course, depending on what level, how old your students are and what level they're at, or how it's working into your classrooms, you can do this in all sorts of different ways. But let's go through some maps. So one of the cool things about European maps that you see over and over again is that they use figures, but they use it to signify and convey information. And so what I think they are telling us all along is they're trying to tell us about native power. And so what you tend to find over and over again are giants on maps. So here we've got this map of Tierra del Fuego, here's another one, and you've got these Patagonian giants who stand feet above any Europeans. Or if we come closer to home, I think we all probably know this famous map by John Smith of Virginia. And of course, I would also point out, if you think about that Samuel Champlain map, if you were to zero in on this map as well, you would actually find the insane intensity of native settlement of all the 23 tributary nations that made up the Powhatan Confederacy under Powhatan, who of course is in the upper left-hand corner. But please note the giant on the right. And of course, John Smith, in his own history of Virginia, and of course, what he was trying to say, that he himself was this noble, daring, fantastic man to be admired, right? That he took on this giant. But see how much Opequencano towers over Smith, right? So they are, I think, conveying a sense of native power here in these figurative terms, right? That this man stands for the Powhatan Confederacy and the power that the Powhatan Confederacy exerted against the British. Now, I will say, on another side note, not to go down too many rabbit holes here, but there's also very good reason to believe that, in fact, Native people did tower over Europeans, because native giants were far healthier. They ate far more protein. And so we have actually accounts from European and then later Anglo-American people who do in fact talk about native leaders towering over them, well over 6 feet. And of course, Europeans do not come from nations where they've had healthy diets. And so they are much shorter. Fantastic story of a Spanish governor of Texas who has finally begged and pleaded and succeeded in getting Comanche leaders to come in to negotiate a peace so that they will stop raiding all the Spanish ranches. And he thinks, ooh, I will honor these great warriors by giving them gifts of military uniforms, and this will appeal to them because they are valorous, strong men. And as they approach San Antonio, they've never seen each other except across battlefields from a distance. And as they approach, he suddenly realizes, oh my God, all the military uniforms are way too short. And he's like, hide them. Oh my God, we'll have to have new ones made for them, especially because they're so much taller than we are. So again, just a little side note, but I do think that these figurative displays on maps are definitely signals of power. Another thing to think about would be the geopolitical landscape. So here we have the coast of North Carolina, where I'm standing, and you will see all those native settlements all along the coast. Or if we go up to Plymouth, here's Plymouth Harbor. Now, you tell me, if you're a European ship, where are you going to land and feel at all safe? Even where you're going to find that they're going to allow you in. Like, we really have to think about these practical matters. Or here we go up to Cape Cod. Again, absolute density of settlement. Or here is the Gulf of Mexico. And so again, we see this density, and occupation is power. Or we might go back, let's go back to Pereira's map. Now, I did sort of suggest, jokingly, that the interior of his map looked a lot like the textbook maps. But here, I actually have to say, they don't at all, because what you will see is, because he knows about Tenochtitlan, the great city of the Nahuas, he actually is assuming that they will find many other great cities. So you can see huge cities across the North American continent. Now, he's not saying he's seen them, but he's assuming they will be there because of this one. So here is Cortez's fantastic drawing of the Aztec capital. And of course, it was so beautiful and it was so amazing. Of course, it was his dream of a lifetime to simply take over control of that beautiful city. But of course, the Nahuas fought so desperately in defense of their city, and the Spanish fought them so desperately to take it, that the entire thing was destroyed. And so, of course, the Spanish have to build a new city on top of it. But then to think about then the beauty and the grandiose nature of these cities. But let's now jump up to the land of the Iroquois. So here is another map, a diagrammic one, an Italian one, that is telling us about the Iroquois city of Hochelaga, which will later become the site of Montreal. But what he's telling you here in this map, and again, this is why the diagrammatic is so important, right, is he's telling you that there are multiple fortifications around this city. And so you can see in the middle, if you look at the letter D, you will find the home of a king. But what he's saying, you can see A, two different places. So that's the main gate into this fortified city. But he's showing you with K being the inner wall and L being the outer wall, right, that there are at least 3 palisades that you would actually have to get through to enter this fortified city. If we then consider Dutch maps, and so this is a sort of bizarre map because we have to imagine it upside down, because what it's showing us is actually Virginia is on the top and Maine is on the bottom. But the more important thing is that upper right-hand corner, which is showing us, again, massive fortified cities. So what they're telling us is, if we go back to the larger map, right? Okay, so this is this land that has this utter richness in animal pelts. If we look at all the animals that feature on this map, right, they're telling you what they're there for, and we're there for the furs. But they're telling you that this is a really well-defended landscape. And so, in fact, we're going to have to make nice with these powerful native nations who live in these cities if we are to then access that fur trade. The other thing we might think about as ways of using maps with our students is to talk about that, in fact, maps often don't show us European knowledge at all. What it shows us is natives' knowledge that they have gained from interpreters, from captives, from people they have enslaved. So this, for example, and this is actually supposed to say an Indian from the Southern Plains. So he is most likely a Wichita. And so this was actually when Oñate was desperately trying to get to what he thought would be Quivira. And he's captured this man, Miguel, and taken him all the way back to Mexico City. and he's being pumped for any information they can give us. Oh, so please tell us, where's the gold? Where are all the people that we need to, negotiate with? And so what this is showing us, and again, I think it's important to think about the different ways of map making and the different ways you convey knowledge, because this is very much about a native conception of the landscape. And what he's giving you here is not, for example, it may give you days travel across the bottom, so that, here, I'll switch to my translation. This is a lovely translation that Paul Mapp, another early American historian, drew. So what he's giving you here across the bottom right are the cities, the Spanish cities that he traveled to on the way to Mexico City. So he's noting that the cities got bigger the further south he went. But otherwise, the rest of the map is conveying the political relations between different native nations, and thus the sources for entry into native trading networks, and then also, of course, what the Spanish, at least, are hoping and believing will be the source for precious metals. If we jump forward 150 years to the same area, and this is, again, information taken from Wichita people, and this is drawn by a French trader who was operating among the Wichita and Caddo nations and trading with them. And so again, what you see is this conception of a geopolitical or maybe a geoeconomical landscape in which what you see on the far right is the Mississippi River, and you can see the bay there. And then what he's telling you is that, of course, if you follow along the Natchitoches River and the Red River, you can then get up to Wichita villages. Then you can see that the Wichitas raid down into Spanish settlements at San Saba and San Antonio to take horses, which they will then trade through the Caddo back to the French. And in fact, the Wichita and Comanche their raids were the #1 suppliers of all horses in Louisiana, just to give you a sense of stuff. So, or if we move on to other very well-known native maps. Now, these are from the Southeast. So this is a Chickasaw map. And again, this was drawn on hide. And what they're trying to tell the governor of the Carolinas are the different political relations with different native nations. And so what are the relations and the alliances that the Carolina officials need to be aware of? Or if we take this map, this is very similar, this Catawba map, and this is also, I think, a very famous map. And what's very cool is an archaeologist, Robin Beck, who has a wonderful book on the Carolinas and the Catawbas, translated it. And so he's telling us again, he's showing us all the different linkages. And so those different lines are telling you who's within the alliance and who's not. But then what Raman did was even cooler. He then translated it to the landscape. And so you can see, right, he makes it very clear that the native map has nothing to do with locations across the landscape. It is about political relations. And so again, right, this is noting native sovereignty, who isn't in our alliances. And so what you can see very clearly are that the Creek are not considered part of the alliances of the Catawba Nation. Okay, so those are sort of general lessons and cool things you can do with maps to teach students different aspects of the early Americas and the arrival of Europeans and what's going on in their conceptions of this landscape. But now I want to talk about how we can pull this all together to help students recognize native sovereignty. And so from here on out, what I want to do is I'm going to use native nations that don't normally make it into textbooks. And then I also am going to speak very clearly about 3 different political economies, because I think we tend to imagine, because our textbooks still teach us and make us think in progressive Whiggish terms about the progression of human civilization somehow is going up from tribes to bands to confederacies to nation states, that we think in very odd terms about political economies determining nationhood. And here I would say one thing, for example, we should probably remember that the largest, most extensive empire in all of human history, the one that controlled the most territory of all time, was the Mongol Empire, and they were non-sedentary. So we need to let go of associating agriculture with nationhood and national borders and sovereignty. But the other thing is we need to be aware of a unique problem I think we have in the United States, and that is that we don't think there were any native nations, large, powerful nations in North America. We recognize, we know all about the Aztec Empire, the Mayan Empire, the Inca Empire, but we don't think anything was going on like that above the Rio Grande. But I would put to you that this is a unique problem coming out of our colonial past. Because, of course, the Spanish, when they wrote their histories of their colonialism and their grand conquest, right, they were glorifying themselves in their histories. But they saw that their glory rested on the fact that they were standing on the shoulders of those empires that had come before them. And so they were standing on the shoulders of the Aztec and Inca empires, and that they were, and we might say, they were saying, wow, we're great because we beat them, or we're great because we were able to force them to ally with us. However you want to conceive of that, Spanish history was written differently, whereas in the United States, it was like, oh no, we're going to erase them all, and we're going to pretend no one ever existed. And so, in fact, we've completely lost sight of these structures of nationhood, even though, of course, we've got all these European records that tell us about kingdoms and nations. Most common term the Spanish used in every single record was nación. So this is why I'm going to go through these different political economies to talk about how sovereign borders can be created and maintained out of different political economies. So first, I want to start with an agriculture sedentary nation, the Caddo. And they would go down in the history books by the Spanish, known as the Kingdom of the Tejas. And so this would be where the state of Texas takes its name. And so the Spanish knew them as the Tejas or the Hassane. The French will record them as the Sine, which is much closer to Hassane. But of course, the Hassane were only one of three different nations within this huge area you're looking at. So the Spanish would tell us that they were a powerful and populous nation with kings or a great lord who ruled with lieutenants over a sovereign land that you can see here, extended well into what we would consider now to be Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. They had cities so extensive, like this one. This city that you're seeing that was mapped out in 1691 extended over 53 miles along the Red River and 18 miles on either side of the Red River. So this was an incredibly extensive settlement. The Caddo also had warriors so powerful that all their neighbors feared them. They were so highly organized that they had a hierarchical governing system. And here you can see, if we zero in on that map again, we can see the compound of the paramount chief and the compound of the paramount spiritual leader, the Inicie, at the Temple Mound. And then I'll go back here. They had an agricultural economy so successful that every community had multi-storied homes. So you can see, it's very hard to see, but they had these multi-storied stones. They had so much grain surplus from their agricultural success, they used it to feed their horses, which the Spanish thought was just amazing. They had a commercial exchange system that was so extensive and so profitable, it reached all the way to New Mexico, the Gulf Coast, and up to the Great Lakes. All of this is also confirmed, I should say, in archaeological records. The Spanish would go on to say that they had a government so well run that it oversaw people's property and crops when they were away on business. And it was a nation so extensive that no one knew where it ended, because the great lord of the Tejas does not permit foreign nations to enter the interior of his country. So why would they say that most interesting of things? Well, they would say it because they kept being denied entry. And if we go to this map, I can absolutely give you a sense of how this would happen, because I have read every single Spanish and French expeditionary record of all and any attempts to enter Caddo lands. And what becomes striking is that every single group goes through the exact same admission rituals. They would be met at the borders, and so the border would be that outer line where you see the dotties. And the story happens in various ways, right? But, oh, well, we ran into this lovely man and his wife and children, and they were so happy to see us, and they said, oh, hey, why don't you stop here? We're going to send word into the interior just to let them know you're here. And so you just hang out, and then we'll send, somebody will be sent, with great pomp and circumstance to welcome you, since you are so fantastic. And of course, that's what the Spanish and the French are thinking. What's actually happening is, of course, that outer area you see are where all their hunting lodges are. And this is border control. And that family wasn't just happening along there. They are monitoring the highways, and they are monitoring their borders. And so when a European group comes, it's like, oh, heck yeah, you're going to be stopped. And so, yes, runners are sent interior. They then come back with multiple men who the Europeans, they sent us a nice escort. I'm like, you're not being escorted, dummy. You're being guarded. You are under security now. And you will not, and it's amazing that they are never allowed to leave the highway. And this is, in fact, the highway I'm now talking about is the one that the Frenchman said was far better than that between Paris and Orléans. And they monitor them every step of the way. And so what you'll see is that, in fact, they're kind of going through these rings of the Caddo domain. So they'll be taken ever inward, and so then they'll begin to see outer villages, and then the villages get bigger, and then they get to ceremonial town centers. And in those town centers, the biggest ones, those are where the Cadi, which is the Caddo term for chief or leader or ruler, their complexes were. And these complexes were very important for all public gatherings within the nation, but then also diplomatic gatherings for foreign embassies and diplomats, and then also, of course, for ritual events as well. I also want to point out very carefully that though this is actually a map I designed, though I have circled those complexes with a line, I want to be absolutely clear here that what is most striking throughout Caddo lands is that they did not have fortified cities. They did not have palisades that defended those cities. And what's even more powerful in terms of understanding the importance of that absence is that just to the northwest of them are all the Wichita nations, and they are also Caddoan speakers. So it is the same political economy, or a very similar political economy, the same language groups, and they absolutely have palisaded villages in the Southern Plains. So the absence of fortified cities in the heart of the Caddo domain, I think, speaks volumes for the power of these border defenses, and that they did not need fortified cities because no one was going to get to those cities without an escort. And no one was going to get there at all if they were not deemed non-threatening. So once the Spanish and French get there, if they towed the line and they seem to not look to be troublemakers, they were very clearly given passports so that they could move within Caddo lands, which also tells you, right, that even once you're in, if you don't have a passport saying that you've been vetted by somebody, if you then happen on to the next village and you don't have something that says, I'm okay, I've been vetted, then you are still in danger. So these passport systems are incredibly important in this area. And so what we'll see then over the 18th century is the Spanish and the French are allowed to establish embassies within Caddo lands. The Spanish will call them missions. The missions will convert absolutely zip-zero nobody because they are not seen by the Caddo as missions, they're seen as embassies. And the French will establish trading ports. So if we then look again at that big Spanish map that I showed you earlier, and we zero in on the area of the Caddo, you will see then this teeny little Presidio that's been built near the mission. And I should point out the Presidio is not there because they think they need defense against the Caddo. It's there because they're trying to make a show of strength about the French, because they know that the French have better relations with the Caddo because the French trade with them. And here you can see again that tiny, if you can see barely the little square dot, red dot in the corner there on the far right, that's the Mission Presidio complex. But what I also want to point out to you is the title on this map, because this says that that is the Provincia de los Tejas. And what it's telling you is, they're not telling you that this is the state of Texas. This is telling you that this is the province of the Tejas Nation, the Tejas Indians. So in point of fact, the Spanish are recognizing that they, in fact, only have an embassy. Now, if we then look at the French maps, again, we've got this huge map, and we've got to zero in to get to the juicy, wonderful detail. And so again, we zero in, we can see all this detail and these. And if you look to the left, you will see the Caddo, you can see the Natchitoches, and you can see the Sine, une nation considerable, right? So they are saying this is a powerful nation, and we are noting their place on the map. Okay, so those were sedentary agriculturalists. Now let's move to a less obvious case. Coahuilteca speakers in what will come to be South Texas and northern Coahuila. And actually, in fact, they aren't all Coahuilteca speakers. There are at least 9 language groups throughout this region, but to simplify just in describing what's going on, I will call them Coahuilteca speakers. So scholars absolutely are reluctant to talk about homelands when it comes to people who have a hunting and gathering political economy. Oh, well, of course, they wander all over. They can't possibly have a homeland. And that is absolutely not what European records tell us. It is absolutely clear that they have territorial claims and borders. They have spaces of control, which is all about the control of the resources within those bordered domains. And so what you will see here, and I should also point out that when you've got singular names, sort of like the Payaya or the Pempoa or the Barado, those are in fact alliances or coalitions of groups, and it will be known to the Spanish as the Barado simply because they perhaps are the largest majority in that group. But there are far more groups within all these different designations. So what's going to happen as they move through this area is that in the summer, all these much smaller family bands that may spread out in other times of the year come together. And you can see in the 3 hash marks that these were the biggest areas that folks came together. And the Spanish would call these rancheria grandes. These were the biggest rancherias they ever saw. And they always saw them at the exact same time of the year. And these were massive gatherings of people from all over. But these were massive gatherings of affiliated people in very specific regions, and they each had their own regions. So then what would happen is the winter, when food sources are scarcer, or when you've got to move to different areas to get them, right? You divide into smaller groups that put less pressure on different sites, right? To spread out the source demands that you were putting on it. But none of the movement throughout these regions is random, right? They move in corridors, they move in very specific zones. It's quite striking. And if you were to, for example, consider the coast of Texas and the solid line, those are all Karankawa speakers. And so the Coapite, the Coco, the Cujane, those are all individual nations, bands within that group. But that border, the archaeological record tells us that that border is hundreds and hundreds of years long and was always there and never budged. And so and it lasts to the 19th century. So it's very striking to think about these borders and how they function. Okay, so Throughout this too, we also then we can consider, and keeping in mind that the map I show, let's see, this map again, when I was showing you all the Tierra da, this was absolutely this region that I was zeroing in on this map. So you can see then the Pampoas and the Carrizos on there. So these are the groups I'm talking about. But what we also know from European records, right, is that Henri Joutel would say that the Colorado River was a dividing ground. We never cross this unless it goes to war. So we know the Colorado River is a border. There are pictographs, there are large painted rocks. There were all sorts of boundary markers throughout these regions. And again, the Spanish record over and over again, the only warfare that takes place is over trespass. So this is in defense of those regions, in defense of those borders that mark access to resources. Okay, so what's going to happen when the Spanish say, "Ooh, okay, we're coming, we're going to establish missions here." And this is going to work completely differently than in Caddo lands. So they're going to come and they are going to establish a mission Presidio complex again. And this will be in the city that we know today as San Antonio de Bejar. And so the whole reason they choose San Antonio is this is the area where those Fronteria Grandes were. And so they are going to where they've seen these very large gatherings of these native allied nations. And if we look at this map, and again, this is a massive map at the John Carter Brown Library, but if we zoom in, and we'll zoom on even further in a minute, what you're looking at is the San Antonio River crossing the map. And you can see 5 different missions that have been established. And then you can see on the left side, you can see the Via of San Antonio and the Presidio that is closest to Mission San Antonio Valero, which you may know better as the Alamo. So the Spanish have come because this is this area of these Fronteria Grandes. And so they're going to have to form alliances, agreements with each one of those different confederations that I've mentioned. So every mission represents a different confederation. If the Spanish had been making treaties at this point, they don't start making treaties until later in the 18th century, then each one of those missions would have been represented by a treaty. But the whole point of them being laid out in this way is that they have to accord with native boundary markers and borders. And if we think about then, particularly the addition of the Spanish Via, what's going on there is that the Spanish are simply another ethnic enclave among these different confederated sites. Then what we also have to remember is that then this should absolutely explain Franciscan records, because the Franciscans will constantly say, "Oh my God, they keep running away from the missions. They never stay." It's like, well, no, dummy, you built the chapel in the middle of their summer encampments. So the only reason they're going to come, only time, is when it's the summer, and they're going to come for the exact same reason they've always been coming to that site, which is to gather in larger groups for large hunting expeditions, for large gatherings, particularly of prickly pear tuna. They come together for ceremonies, they come together for healing, they come together for courtship, because young men and young women need to find partners in other bands. So there will be marriages that are used for alliance purposes, and they are coming to negotiate political and military alliances among themselves. So in fact, what's happening is they're using these sites as they always have used the sites, and then they leave for the rest of the year to maintain the rest of their domain and to maintain and use the rest of the resources in those domains. So why did they even allow the Spanish to come? Well, we might consider what the Spanish would bring to an alliance if you are brokering an alliance with the Spanish. And they bring defensive resources. So this is an aerial view of San Jose, which was the largest mission in San Antonio. And I think if you look at that, it has very much the appearance of a fort with all those walls. And that was absolutely what it was. And what did the Spanish bring with them? They brought cattle, they brought horses, and they brought guns. Spanish law forbid the trading or giving of guns and horses to Native people. And I can tell you that every single Native person in San Antonio was armed and given horses because it was needed for defense of the region. the Spanish weren't offering the defense. It was all the far more native men who far outnumbered the Spanish who were in charge of defense. Because if we go back to that map again and we look to the left of the little Villa of San Antonio, you will see here is where the enemies enter. Because in 1721, the Spanish awoke one morning to find a row of arrow shafts with red cloth flying from the top of them, planted along the wall of their Presidio. And all of this was to say, hello, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we just wanted to alert you that you are sitting on the Apache border. And we think you need to know where you are. So again, if we start with a big old map and we zoom in, there's that sweet little old Presidio. And all of a sudden, look north. Oh my gosh, there are Apache nations everywhere. And this is why you would welcome the Spanish as potential allies. The Apaches in Spanish records will be known as a great nation, so numerous and extensive that their rancherias extend for 800 miles between the areas that the Spanish have established in what will become New Mexico and Texas. And so if we look at this map, and then I can actually show you a different map, and we'll come back to this one in a minute, and we zoom in again, you can see all those little red tinted areas are their rancherias. And of course, the Spanish can't give us nearly the amount of detail because they haven't seen them. But what we should imagine are, in fact, rancherias that extend for 3 miles along rivers and that can have 2,000 of those hide lodges. And those extensive stretches of rancherias that the Spanish are writing about are, in fact, a form of border control. Because here we've gotten to our third case, our third political economy, and this is a raiding and hunting economy. And we absolutely don't think that they have borders either, because they're always moving. But what in fact is essential to understand about those rancherias, right, is that mobility does not in any sense diminish a sense of homeland or borders. It is in fact a way to claim territory, expand territory, and then maintain control of it. So what would happen again is that you would have extended family bands that might join together in coalitions for warfare or for raiding. But in the normal course of time, they would move around all the lands that they claimed. And when dispersed, each family band had their own rancherias, which controlled individual hunting territories. And thus what they did is they spread out farming, they spread out land holding, they spread out land management, and they spread out border control. And so, as another Spanish officer will say, they know with unmistakable certainty in which lands the surrounding rancherias should be living, according to their well-known familiarity with the mountains, valleys, and water holes that they possess. In contrast to what we might know about the borders of Pacharia, the Spanish knew nothing about what was going on in this region that we're looking at in this map. The power of Apache borders is seen by the utter and absence of Spanish knowledge of what was beyond that. And I can tell you that for more than 100 years, the Spanish might have had a little settlement at Santa Fe and a little settlement at San Antonio, but they could not cross directly from one to the other because of the presence of Apache nations and then later Comanche nations. So the few times they would attempt it would end in debacles. So if the Apaches aren't worried about Comanche, the Spanish, and they're not allying with the Spanish, who are they thinking about? And what they're thinking about are Comanches to the north that I just mentioned, right? And again, right, for both the Comanches and Apaches, raiding is a growth strategy, it's a form of territorial expansion, and so it is geopolitical. We tend to think about raiding as being about taking horses, and that is certainly important if you are establishing a massive trading empire, as the Comanches did, with 23 tributary nations who owed them all sorts of things. And you can see the golden lines that are showing you how far south the raiding was reaching, that it was getting almost all the way to Mexico City. But what's really fascinating if you look at traditional stories, they will say, oh, well, the Comanches beat the Apaches. And they will talk about it as being a blood feud. Like, of course it wasn't a blood feud. This is a border war. They're both powerful nations, and they're fighting it out, just like France and England did forever in Europe. But what we should keep in mind is that, in fact, the Apaches didn't lose. They just shifted south. And so what we then find is that San Antonio becomes engulfed within the lands of the Lipan and the Mescalero. And so it's this very interesting, and of course they invade into Coahuila. So from a Spanish perspective, the Apaches never lost. They just shifted south. And so, we should keep in mind again about shifting borders don't mean losses, they just mean that they shift somewhere else. So I want to stop here and just pause to consider the Spanish Empire. I'm going to skip over those. The Spanish was the largest empire in all of the Americas. The Viceroyalty of New Spain had over 1 million Spanish colonists, 2 million indigenous residents. The capital city of Mexico that you're looking at here was the most sophisticated metropolis in the Western Hemisphere, with its Baroque architecture, its broad avenues, and one of the world's greatest universities. Yet far more important, if you were living anywhere in the far northern provinces, so-called, of New Spain, if you were in what would become Arizona, if you were in New Mexico, if you were in Texas, it was far more important to your day-to-day existence and survival to be aware of the fact that you were sitting on the borders of native nations. It made no difference at all that you were part of the Viceroyalty. And so if we go back to this map here, right, and we're going to look at that top right map, and we zoom in again, what we see is, so here is the teeny little community of Los Cedes on the edge of the Caddo world. We can look at San Antonio sitting on the Apache-Comanche border, and we can look at La Bahia, which sat on the border of the Karankawas. And when we think about, this is a great map that shows you how far Spanish expansion had come by 1800. And you can see these tiny little islands in those places that I just mentioned, so that the biggest one you can see there is Santa Fe, supposedly. And you kind of look at it and go, huh, I wonder what's going on there. Were they not trying? But when we look at this, we far better understand what was going on and what was impeding the advance of the Spanish Empire. But let's think about 1800. Let's think about another map. So here we're back to a textbook map again. And this is all the area of the early Republic of the United States. But if we put that map over this one, which is far more realistic, we need to pause to consider that 300 years at this point have passed since Columbus, 25 years after the Declaration of Independence, and yet more than 75%, I would say 85% of North America is still in the hands of Native nations. And in fact, 50% of what's in orange, so even 50% of what that textbook was claiming, is actually still in the hands of Native nations. I surely do think that this map is something that would make our students rethink their whole conception of America history. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions that are going to be, oh, and I can't see the little audience chat.
Very good, very good. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left. And so there are a few questions that have come in. Thank you so much. This is it's been so robust, but so rich. And just looking through the audience chat and all the responses that we're getting just from everyone who's interrogating and really kind of taking deep dives on the materials. One question related to primary sources and how else can we use primary sources to emphasize that nationhood is not tied to agrarian means of production? How else can we use primary resources to emphasize that nationhood is not necessarily tied to agrarian means of production?
Well, I think the maps go a ways, at least, of understanding borders, I think. I do think we have to go into, if for the Spanish and French, it, I think, is far more powerful than to look at diplomatic negotiations. And what you see, for example, across the far northern provinces of New Spain, the Spanish are desperately trying to establish peace treaties with various powerful native nations because they can't get past their lands. And so when you do deep dives into, Presidio records of officers, now, of course, this would require Spanish, but, it's back to those treaties, I think, is the easiest thing to think about. If some of the Lakota treaties, because we think about the growth of the Comanche Empire on the southern plains, but we've got to remember all the Lakota and Dakota and Nakota nations on the northern plains, who the United States first is desperately seeking as allies, and they will sign all sorts of treaties in which they are asking for their help. They will, and if you look at the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1850, I'm pretty sure that's Fort Laramie. Oh, maybe it's. Oh, I can't remember which title it is. The Lakota, the U.S. officials will say, well, we're trying to, mark your borders, and there's a map that accompanies it. And the Lakota are like, oh, no. You have totally misdrawn the lines. We took those lands south of the Platte River just the way you've been taking lands from other native nations, and you darn will redraw that line to show that those are within our borders. And so I really think, the Comanches and Lakotas and Apaches in particular, just since they tend to be the ones our students know best because of Hollywood movies, offer the best examples of utter power in terms of non-secondary nations. Another really interesting fact, simply to give students, is that, in fact, Comanches had been farmers, and they give it up because, in fact, it makes far more economic sense if you're thinking in a profit. They weren't necessarily thinking in a profit margin, but they're in the capitalist terms in which we think. But they give up farming because it makes no sense. The average Comanche man by the mid-19th century had herd a minimum of 250 horses, just of himself, and that was his. And they would raid south. All the horses they took from Mexico, they would bring back, and they didn't actually think those horses were so good, so they would trade those to other native nations, and they were breeding their own horses, and they bred specific horses for raiding and others for hunting. And so I think when you think about the giving up of agriculture to go to a fully hunting and raiding economy, that is a powerful point in terms of marking the prosperity that non-sedentary life can give you.
Thank you so much for that. There's another question that we had that was asked pretty early on when you were discussing the native highways and infrastructure. They found it intriguing, but are there any efforts to digitize or map via GIS or geospatial technology those highways? Just your initial discussion of them, people realized just how vast and how well planned they were. Is there a resource that teachers can access that in some way as attempting to preserve that or in any way digitize it?
Well, I think there are any number of scholarly projects that I think are really trying to get onto this. And so there's a new one out of the University of New Mexico that Sam Truitt is heading up, and he is working with native grad students, and they're going to try to start creating maps of different highways there. I know another scholar that's working on Iroquois highways. And so, but these are sort of individual projects. So I do think we need some far more massive project that would bring it all together. So I think there are projects that have been initiated. And I do think, I know because my research has been based or was based in Texas, that I know there have certainly been the Texas Historical Commission has had any number of projects with archaeologists to map these different maps. Because, of course, that Caddo highway I was talking about becomes the El Camino Real, that the Spanish will simply rename it. And so they had a huge project just to talk about all the history along that highway. But that's just one. So I absolutely agree that we need something bigger that brings it together. And I think we've got the beginnings of individual projects that will produce the research that we can then create something bigger. But as of right now, yeah, I think unfortunately that it's going and finding individual maps.
Wow, that's so impressive. We have a question from Madison. Madison's question is to your knowledge, how often would groups like the Caddo and Comanche trade? During my undergrad, I did research and wrote a paper on the representation of Native Americans in Texas newspapers in the mid-19th century. During this research, I came across an article about a girl who had been purchased seemingly by the Comanche. This wasn't particularly surprising until I discovered this took place in Missouri, which is pretty far outside Comancheria and the traditional trade routes.
Okay, so, well, Comanche trade routes extended. Let's see if I can get back to Pekka's map. So this is the map from Pekka Hämäläinen's The Comanche Empire, which I should say I've worked with the former tribal historic preservation officer of the Comanche Nation, Jimmy Arterberry, and he still says that this is one of the best histories of Comanches written. But if you look at this, you can see how utterly expensive Comanche trading networks were. So absolutely, they could be trading huge distances. But, the archaeological record shows the vast extent of these trading networks. It's not necessarily that, say, Caddo were traveling all the way to the Great Lakes, but they had networks that would bring them goods from the Great Lakes. So in some sense, I don't want to get too carried away, but, Amazon can bring us goods from Paris if it wants, right? So they do have networks that bring them goods great distances. So I think it's very interesting that, and again, I should say, as history teachers and historians, I think a really interesting and important resource for us is to look at archaeology, because I think the other really interesting distinction in the United States as opposed to in Latin America, for example, is we say that history only begins in 1492 with the arrival of Europeans, and thus we consign all Native history before European arrival to archaeology, and we don't even say it's history, which is nonsense. Of course, Native people had history, and so we do need to access, archaeological reports just have reams of information for us that flesh out these worlds. And in fact, I think archaeologists have far more sophisticated notions of Native political economies than any historians out there. So those are resources too to consider.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a question from Rob. Rob's question is whether there are any books or resources that you could recommend that give a clearer perspective on pre-Columbian North American civilizations or indigenous populations.
So resources in terms of secondary readings or?
It's a question was what books. So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think, well, I guess I should say Pekka Hämäläinen has a new book out called Indigenous Continent, and I think he, although to be very good, I guess that's not pre-Columbian. He's really fleshing out the different power relations and their the forms they take across all of North America. But he does consider the entire continent, though he is actually a specialist in the plains and so a specialist in Comanche and Lakota history. So in terms of in a sense, to be perfectly honest, 1491, I can't think of the author's name, but it's a book this is silly that I can't think of it. 1491 is written by a journalist or a popular writer, so not an academic, but he's really good at synthesizing academic work, so the work of historians and archaeologists, and doing it in a really nice, readable way. And so I think that book is a good, fun read to start with. It may be a little dated now, but yeah, because archaeologists publish so fast. Oh my God, it's amazing. And they are just constantly finding new information. And so, I think we have this sense that, history doesn't change that much, but actually archaeologists are changing our understandings of stuff all the time.
Thank you for that.
Oh, yes, Charles Mann. Thank you, Angela. Yes, Charles Mann. Oh, how terrible that I couldn't remember that.
Good deal. Good deal. Thank you for that. I'll ask another. It's actually from Ali. Ali's question. Again, are there any large or organized indigenous movements seeking autonomy over their land today?
Oh my gosh, all of them. As I said, there are 574 Native nations with formal political relations with the United States today. So we really have to recognize that this is absolutely ongoing. That this is not this is a continuum that continues and will long continue. But I think too, if we think about the McGirt ruling, and granted the Supreme Court did roll it back a bit a year later, but the McGirt ruling was really important because what it recognized was that it didn't have to be a land-based, territorially based sovereign power, that they were in fact recognizing the sovereign power of the Creek Nation to adjudicate within the lands that had been there. So the McGirt does not return any lands in Oklahoma that had once been part of the Creek Nation to the Creek Nation. It just recognizes their sovereign jurisdictions over that land. So in a company with the state of Oklahoma. So in a sense, right, it's putting them on par with the state of Oklahoma. So in fact, what's very interesting to think about too is that sovereignty today often doesn't have to have that land-based accompaniment to be real.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And everyone, I believe that is our time for this evening. Dr. Barr, we thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise with us and the ways that our educators can help to address the problem of textbook maps in the classroom, and also the use of maps as a powerful visual aids for understanding the history of Indigenous nations and understanding the presence and power of those Indigenous nations. So we're truly appreciative of you, and thank you so, so much for all that you are doing. Thank you all for spending. Yeah, the passion and the energy. I did not mention that in the audience chat, but several times over, just how passionate you were about it. It really came across, and the teachers really enjoyed that. Again, as I said from the beginning of the session, they were populating the chat. And so right now, there are just thank yous that are flooding the chat. So thank you. And thank you for spending your evening with us. A special
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. A special thank you to Jessica Odom for your service on the Teacher Advisory Council, as well as just your presence and contributions to the chat tonight. We really appreciate it. It was absolutely awesome. And also, I encourage you all to just keep up with everything that's going on at the National Humanities Center right now through our various social media channels. We have the information posted above for you. And you all should be receiving email updates from us, just letting you know everything that's going on. I also invite you to join us again for our next webinar, scheduled for February 23rd, 2023, with Mia Bay, Traveling Black, Race, and Resistance on the Road, the Rails, and the Skyways. And so we will be back here and same format, and just continue to bring that energy. And just, again, I consistently shout out our teachers because you're awesome. The things that you're doing for your students, the things that you're doing for the humanities. Just know that you're appreciated and you are valued. And I look forward to just continuing to learn from you all and to connect with you all. If I can ever be of assistance to you all, please feel free to reach out to me. As I mentioned before, it's mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Take care and have a great night.